G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Faith Foundations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this third part of the biblical principles of giving. This will finish off the series for us tonight. So we're looking now at in the amount of giving. We're looking at the New Testament principle, which is spirit-controlled giving. And this is the second section of the amount a believer should give. And we're going to see here that the New Testament principle is not based upon the tithe, but it's based upon spirit-controlled giving. We're going to look at it in two areas. We're going to look at it first up in the new basis for giving. This is the first area of the principle of New Testament spirit-controlled giving, is that the believer is not under the law, not under the Mosaic law in any way, shape, or form, but under grace. In Romans chapter 6, verse 14, Paul wrote, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." And he brings us out again in Galatians 5:18, where he says, "But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law." So the first thing that Paul emphasized in both of these passages is that the believer is no longer under the law, he's speaking about Mosaic law here. Now, Gentiles were never under the law, and Jewish believers who had been under the law are no longer under the law. Instead, they're under two things. They're under two things. First, according to the Romans passage, they are under grace. Now, being under grace means that they're no longer under the law. It can't be under the two of them. So if you're under grace, you cannot be under the law. And so the believer now does not give on the basis of the Mosaic law. The tithe, which is what the church talks about today, the tithe was always based upon and rooted in the Mosaic law. Because the believer is not under the Mosaic law, he's not to give on that basis. The believer is now under grace and should be practicing grace giving, not law giving, which was the tithe. A good example of this method in action is Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 35. Here in this passage is the principle of grace giving or spirit-controlled giving in action. They gave as they felt led to give. There was no specific mandatory laws were handed down. No specific percentages were handed down. And the principle is that the believer is not under law, but under grace. Therefore, the believer must practice grace giving or spirit-controlled giving. Now, here is what Acts 4, 32 to 35 says. "And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and soul. And not one of them said that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. And with great power gave the apostles their witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. For neither was there among them any that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold. And they laid them at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made to each according as anyone had need." So that was the example of spirit-controlled giving that we saw there. Now the procedure, the second area of the New Testament spirit-controlled or grace giving is the procedure which is stated in 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 2. "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I gave order to the churches of Galatia, so also do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let each one of you lay by him in store as he may prosper, that no collections be made when I come." So the procedure here for spirit control or grace giving is based upon 4 steps. First of all, giving under grace should be done systematically, not haphazardly. And this procedure, according to Paul, should take place on the first day of the week, which is the period of time from sundown Saturday to sundown Sunday. So on that day, the first day of the week, the believer should then sit down and determine in a systematic way what portion of his income he will turn over to the Lord. So the first step in spirit-controlled grace giving is that it must be done systematically, and it should be done on the first day of the week. Now, deciding what portion of one's income to give back to the Lord should not be done haphazardly, but it should be done in a systematic way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's individually. So the second step that he points out concerning grace giving is that it should be done individually. He says, let each one of you. So giving is mandatory for every believer as an individual. Paul is not dealing here with corporate giving in this passage. He's dealing with individual giving. Now, this verse speaks against the concept of storehouse tithing, which we spoke about in the last session, where believers put all their money into a storehouse and the elders or the deacons choose how it's going to be distributed. Quite the contrary here. Giving should be done individually. Let each one of you. The second step here teaches two things. First of all, it teaches that giving is mandatory for every believer. Secondly, it should not be done corporately, but individually. Now, this doesn't mean that giving should never be corporate. It's quite all right to give one's money to the missions program of the local church. The point here is that this type of giving should not be the totality of the way an individual gives to missions. One should support the missionary program of the local church. But if there's a mission or a missionary for whom one feels burdened and that is not being financed or supported by the local church, then one should feel free to give a portion of one's gift to that person or mission as well. So giving should be done individually. Third, the third step on the spirit-controlled giving is found in the expression, lay by him in store. More literally, the Greek reads, lay to himself in store. So this third principle is one of private deposit. The picture here is that the money which one decides to give back to the Lord should be stored away in a specific private place, not a public place like the church bank account or the church treasury. And having stored the money away in a private place, it can now be distributed by the individual as the Holy Spirit leads. Now, the money that we lay aside to the Lord's work does not go into the church treasury, but into what you might call, or I might call, the God account, okay? So this would be an account which is separate from my everyday bank account. And from then on, it's God's money. Once the money that we have organized and systematically thought through and said, okay, that's how much I'm going to give. Once we put it into that God account, no matter how much money you need elsewhere, you will distribute the money in God's account as the Spirit leads. Once you've laid money aside, it's God's money. When you're presented with a need of a particular missionary or ministry of the local church, you don't have to sit down and see if you can afford to give in some way to meet this need. The money that has already been set aside, it is already God's money. So it's only a matter of deciding how much of that money you want to give to any specific purpose, program, mission, missionary, or local church. So this is the third step, to lay aside money in private deposit. It's to be stored in a specific private place, not public, to be distributed by the individual as the Spirit leads. And remember, once you put it aside, it belongs to God. That's God's money, which you have purposed to put aside for giving. You can't put it into the God account and say, I'm going to pay the electricity bill this month and pull it out. It's not yours to do that with. It is yours to give to missions needs. Fourth step is that spiritual controlled grace giving should be done proportionally. Well, why do we say this? Because Paul says, as he may prosper. So spirit-controlled giving is not based upon the tithe. The believer should not make a blanket decision that he's going to give 10% and that is that. Sometimes a believer may only be able to give only 5%. Sometimes it may be 10%. Sometimes it could be 20, 30, 40, or even 90%. Sometimes if all one's needs are met, one may be able to give 100%. So it's not tied to 10%. So as I said, maybe you can only be able to afford to give 5%. So you give 5%. The amount or proportion which a believer gives will differ at different times. So this also is spirit-controlled giving. It should be done proportionately. So if God has prospered you exceedingly well in 1 week, you can give more. Now, the 4 steps of spirit-controlled grace giving are: first up, it should be done systematically. Second, it should be done individually. Third, it should be put away in private deposit. And fourth, it should be done proportionately. So how much an individual gives will be different at different times, because God prospers the believer in different ways at different times. All right. Now, we're going to look at the distinction between the 2 principles. The third section of the amount the believer should give is a distinction between the Old Testament principle and the New Testament principle. Now, in the Old Testament, failure to pay the tithe under the Mosaic law brought wrath and judgment. But failure to give liberally under grace, the New Testament law, brings no reward from God. The New Testament teaches that the more one gives, the more one receives. So there's a distinction between the two, the Old Testament form of giving and the New Testament form of giving. Now, who can we give to? Here we're going to look at the recipients of giving. This is the third main category in the biblical principles of giving, and this is the recipients. To whom or to what cause should the believer be giving? It's set out in the Bible. There are 5 recipients of biblical giving. First up is the believer's family. So this is the first recipient of biblical giving, is the believer's family. The believer's key responsibility is for the needs of the family. The Bible takes a very dim view of those who fail in this area. Now, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, Paul wrote this. He says, "But if any provides not for his own, and especially his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So notice the view of a person here who fails to provide for the needs of his family. According to Paul, even if this person may claim to be doing it for spiritual reasons, he's not being spiritual at all. He may not have verbally denied the faith, but in his practice and practical life, he has denied the faith. Because part of the workings of faith is to provide for the needs of the family. So, the one who fails to provide for the needs of the family has, in practice at least, denied the faith. And for that reason, Paul says he is worse than an unbeliever. Well, how can a believer be worse than an unbeliever? Well, while an unbeliever does not claim to be doing the Lord's work, he does not claim to be doing anything for God's glory. A believer does make such claims. But if in practical life he denies that fact, then he's worse than an unbeliever. Why? Because he brings reproach and dishonor on the Lord whom he claims to serve. Therefore, the believer's key responsibility is for the needs of his family. And it should be emphasized here that this concerns the needs of the family, not the wants. It's the needs of the family. So giving must never be sacrificed for the sake of wants. It is always for needs. What does the family need? Not what the family would like. So giving may have to be sacrificed for the sake of one's family needs, but it must never be sacrificed for the sake of the family wants. You know, we want an 85-inch or whatever it is TV. That's a want. It's not a need. Now, second recipient of giving is the work of the ministry. And that ministry is things such as the local church. The believer has the obligation to support the local church that he joins. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 7 to 14, Paul emphasized the fact that the minister has the right to live off of the gospel. Here we go. We've just got it here. And we see the obligation here in 1 Corinthians 9, 7 to 14. Verse 7. What soldier ever serves at his own charges? Who plants a vineyard and eats not the fruit thereof? Or who feeds a flock and eats not of the milk of the flock? Do I speak these things after the manner of men? Or says not the law also the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox when he treads out the corn. Is it for the oxen that God cares? Or says he it assuredly for our sake? Yea, for our sake it was written. Because he that ploughs ought to plough in hope, and he that threshes to thresh in the hope of partaking. So, if we sowed, he goes on to say, if we sowed unto you spiritual things, is it a great matter if we shall reap your carnal things? If others partake of this right over you, do not we yet more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we bear all things, that we may cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Know ye not that they that minister about sacred things eat of the things of the temple, and they that wait upon the altar have their portion with the altar? Even so did the Lord ordain that they that proclaim the gospel should live off the gospel. So in verse 11 here, Paul clearly spells out the principle. He says the one who sows spiritual things has the absolute right to reap from it material blessings. Believers have the obligation to support the work of the ministry and, especially in this case, to support the work of the local church. The passage which gives an example of those who fulfill the obligation and supported the work of the ministry is Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 16. But I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your thought for me, wherein you did indeed take thought, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learnt in whatsoever state I am, therein to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know also how to abound. In everything and in all things have I learned the secret, both to be filled and to be hungry, both to abound and to be in want. I can do all things in him that strengthens me. Howbeit you did well that you had fellowship with my affliction, and you yourselves also know, ye Philippians, that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church had fellowship with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent once and again unto my need. So the Philippians are good examples of those who fulfilled their obligation of supporting the work of the ministry. The local church of Philippi supported the work of the ministry that Paul was doing, which was planting new churches. So one should support the work of the ministry, particularly the work of the local church. Now, included within the framework of the local church are individuals who should be supported, and these include the missionary or the evangelist, as was pointed out in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 to chapter 9, verse 15. Now, we certainly won't read that lot. It's too long for here. Now, also within the framework of the local church, the pastor should be supported according to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 to 18. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and in teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox when he treads out the corn. And the laborer is worthy of his hire. So the teaching elder is the pastor, and those who are teaching elders should be worthy of double honor. The Greek word used here for honor is not the usual word. It's the word time, but it is a financial term meaning remuneration. Therefore, the pastor or the teaching elder is worthy of double remuneration. So if one takes Paul's word seriously, the pastor, the teaching elder, should receive double the average income of the congregation. The second recipient of one's giving should be the work of the ministry, and this involves the work of the local church, the missionary, the evangelists, and the pastors or teaching elders of that church. Now we move on to the third thing, which is Jewish missions. The third recipient of biblical giving is a follow-up on the second one. In missionary giving, the emphasis should be on Jewish missions. And the Bible divides missions into two categories. Now, most Western churches have also divided missions into two categories. And invariably, these are the home missions and the foreign missions. But those are not the two categories used in the scriptures. The two scriptural categories are Jewish missions and Gentile missions. And we can find it in Galatians chapter 2 and Romans chapter 11 and Acts chapter 15. So the two scriptural categories are Jewish missions and Gentile missions. And because there are two types of missions, the emphasis should be on Jewish missions, especially on the part of Gentile believers. And this comes out in Romans chapter 15, verses 25 to 27. Excuse me. Romans 15, 25 to 27 says this. But now I say, I go unto Jerusalem, ministering unto the saints. For it has been the good pleasure of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints that are at Jerusalem. Yes, it has been their good pleasure, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, they owe it to them also to minister unto them in carnal things. So in Romans 15, 25 to 27, Paul builds on something that he has already he also wrote, in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to chapter 3, verse 6. Ephesians 2, 11 to 3, 6. He pointed out in a rather detailed way that the Gentile believers have become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings. And because they become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings, according to Paul, the Gentile believers have become indebted to the Jews, especially Jewish believers. Now, the way of fulfilling or paying off their indebtedness is by sharing their material things with Jewish believers. As Gentiles have become partakers in their spiritual things, they are now to fulfill their indebtedness by giving in a material way to Jewish believers. And that is why every local church should have some Jewish missionary organization they can support in their missionary budget, and therefore fulfill the church's obligation. Now, what Paul teaches here is in keeping with what he said earlier in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, where he says, right back there, he says, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes. It's to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So the gospel is to the Jew first. And this principle applies in both active evangelism and passive evangelism. Now, active evangelism is when one is doing the work of an evangelist. That's what Paul did throughout the book of Acts. Remember, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, but he always went to the Jew first in active evangelism. Secondly, the principle of Romans 1, verse 16 also applies to passive evangelism. Passive evangelism is when one supports those doing the work of evangelism. And this is the point of Romans 15. The principle of to the Jew first also applies to passive evangelism. So there should be an emphasis in one's missionary giving on Jewish missions. So if one's local church is not supporting a Jewish mission, one might encourage them to consider supporting at least one of several Jewish missionaries working in the field by putting them in their missionary budget. Or if an individual believer is not yet supporting a Jewish mission, he might pray to the Lord and ask his guidance as to which Jewish mission God would like him to support on a regular basis. So the third recipient is a missionary to the Jews, doing the work of Jewish evangelism and discipleship. Now, the fourth recipient of one's giving should be the Bible teacher according to Galatians 6:6. But let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teaches in all good things. So what's this saying is that the one who is being taught in the word is obligated to support the teacher with his material goods. It might be a pastor, it might be a Sunday school teacher, it could be a disciple maker, it could be someone who teaches the Bible on television or a radio, or a Bible teacher on CDs. Any of those, if with any of those you're benefiting from their teaching, you should support them in some way. So if one is learning the word from some particular individual or organization, then he has the obligation to share his material goods with that Bible teacher. A brother in need. This is the fifth recipient here. It's a brother in need. We find this in James chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. If a brother or sister be naked and in lack of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Go in peace, be ye warmed and filled, and yet you give them not the things needful of the body, what does it profit? Even so faith, if it have not works, is dead in itself. So what we see here is that a fifth recipient of one's giving should be a brother who is in need because of circumstances beyond his control. If he simply refuses to work, then one has no obligation to that individual. Now, if he's lost a job for one reason or another, if he's become incapacitated financially in some way and he's in need, then this is also a proper recipient of finances from God's account, the account that you set aside the first day of the month, first day of the week. Now, one may not see this as giving to a ministry, but ministering to a brother in need is a ministry in and of itself, according to James right here. In this case, of course, one, for some missions or ministry organizations, you can ask for a tax receipt, but in the case of an individual, you can't ask for a tax deductible receipt. In this kind of situation, one will not be able to deduct the amount from one's taxes. So even someone, for instance, who's going to Bible college or seminary would qualify in this category, who can't afford to go but feels called to go. So here's a way that one can give apart from getting a tax deductible receipt. So this is a fifth valid recipient. It's a brother in need. So what's our conclusion after all of this? Well, these are the biblical principles of giving, and one must be careful to use the principles that do apply on the New Testament giving. It cannot be emphasized too much that the believer is not under the Mosaic law. Believers do not give on the basis of the tithe, but they give on the basis of the New Testament principle, which is grace giving or spirit-controlled giving. And that, brothers and sisters, wraps up the study on the biblical principles of giving. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. And thank you for making it a good series.